Chapter 6 The Dream of Pontiac. In an Indian village on the banks of the Ecorse River, 15 miles from Fort Detroit, an immense council of chiefs and warriors was being held the morning of April 27th, 1763. This was no ordinary tribal meeting, for in the huge circle squatted representatives of tribes 1,000 miles apart, Crees and Nipissings from the far north, Chickasaws from the lower Mississippi, and almost all the tribes in between, wild Chippewas, Wyandots, survivors of the Hurons, Potawatomis, Winnebagoes, Sacs, and Foxes, Kickapoos. Ferocious Senecas and Cayugas from the Iroquois Confederacy, Miamis, Shawnees, Delawares, and Ottawas. Every warrior was vivid with war paint, decorated with feathers or horned head dresses, and sitting attentive, silent, and grim. For hours orators had been speaking, but now came the climax as one chief rose. He was not above middle height, but his figure was muscular and athletic. His complexion was dark, his features bold and stern, his bearing commanding. Everyone there knew of him, Pontiac, the great chief of the Ottawas, possessor of all the Indian talents. He had been one of the leaders, perhaps the leader, in the defeat of Braddock. Elsewhere he had fought for the French, and Montcalm, the French general, presented him the full uniform of a French officer, which Pontiac wore on a few occasions. Now, however, he was dressed in the costume of his people, plumed and painted as for war. When he began to speak, it was with the deep voice and flaming eloquence of a born orator, and his hearers drank in every word, for what he was proposing to them was so radical and daring that only he among them all could possibly have conceived of it. First, he recited the grievances of the Indians. The English, who now occupied Canada and the Ohio Valley, were not the friends the French had been, he said. No longer were gifts of guns, ammunition, blankets, pipes, and other articles lavished as in the good French times. Worse, Indians who visited forts where once they had been honored guests, now were subjected to insults and often thrown out. Furthermore, the country was overrun with English traders, many of them scoundrels, who cheated the Indians, dishonored their women, and brought drunkenness into their camps. Then, his voice rising, Pontiac told his listeners why he had summoned them there. It was a plan he had slowly matured over 2 long years of pondering and persuasion. In its simplest form, this was what he proposed: a simultaneous attack by all the different tribes on every fort in the Lake and Ohio country, in which all were to be destroyed at once. The forts were to be taken by stratagem or surprise, the settlements overwhelmed by fire and tomahawk. The time was set by a certain phase of the moon. Nobody but Pontiac could possibly have welded those divergent and often hostile tribes into one force, but for the time being, bitter hatreds were forgotten under the spell of his personality, and as one man the chiefs and warriors agreed to his scheme to wipe out every white man west of the Allegheny Mountains, and make those mountains and the Ohio River the frontiers of a realm for Indians only. Having finished, with a final burst of eloquence that left his audience in fanatical excitement and eagerness, he dismissed them to return to their respective countries and carry out his plan. What happened thereafter was like a dreadful nightmare, almost as, by a single blow, the forts at Michilimackinac, Sault Ste. Marie, Green Bay, St. Joseph, Quinton, Miami, Sandusky, Presque Isle, LeBoeuf, and Venango fell. Some, like Presque Isle, were taken by storm. Others, like Michilimackinac, were captured by stratagem. At Michilimackinac, the Chippewas and Sacs invited the garrison to watch a game of ball play, a rough and exciting sport, the forerunner of modern lacrosse, played with rackets and a ball. Unsuspecting, the soldiers watched the racing, yelling contestants, until suddenly the ball rose like a meteor, and as if by accident, soared within the walls of the fort. Instantly both sides of Indians rushed after it, whooping, and the soldiers, thinking it perfectly natural, allowed them to do so. Once inside, the warriors turned on the garrison and massacred all but a very few, who with the commander, Major Etherington, were held as prisoners. Most of the other garrisons, overwhelmed, were slaughtered or tortured to death. The handful at the little fort on Green Bay was saved by a curious circumstance. One great Indian people had been visited by Pontiac's envoys in vain. The Sioux, who were reported to have 30,000 warriors. Their most hated enemies were the Chippewas, and they would have nothing of a scheme in which those foes played a part. Instead of joining Pontiac, the Sioux sent a chief to the Menominee, who lived around Green Bay, with a brief ultimatum: protect the English garrison, or the Sioux will come and wipe you out. As a result of that haughty message, the Menominee not only allowed Lieutenant Gorrell and his 17 men to leave peacefully, but undertook to escort them. In Bateau, guarded by 90 warriors in canoes, Gorrell's party set off up the bay. Near its mouth, the Chippewa war party was reported, and the Menominee stripped for battle, ready to fight for the Englishmen. The Chippewas, however, refrained from attacking. Crossing Lake Michigan, they stopped at an Ottawa village near Michilimackinac, where the Menominee found Major Etherington and 8 other survivors of the surprise attack, and, hard as it is to believe, persuaded the Ottawas to free them. With this added party, they paddled across Lake Huron, and by way of Georgian Bay, French River, Lake Nipissing, and several portages, reached the Ottawa River, down which they passed, delivering their charges safely at Montreal. Though he succeeded in his thunderbolt attack against the smaller forts, Pontiac failed in surprising his 2 main objectives: Fort Detroit, which controlled the water traffic in the Great Lakes system, and Fort Pitt, built on the ruins of Fort Duquesne, which guarded the frontier. His own plan against Detroit was foiled when a Chippewa girl, who was in love with Major Henry Gladwin, the commander, told the latter that on May 7th, Pontiac intended to enter the fort on a supposedly peaceful mission with 60 braves, each of whom would carry a loaded gun under his blanket. Gladwin had his men stand to arms, and Pontiac at first glance saw his plan had failed. After smoking and talking, he withdrew with his braves. At once Pontiac's swarming warriors began a blistering fire on the fort, which they kept up for 6 hours, while all the English who dwelled in the little settlement about the fort were massacred, although the French Canadians there were not molested. Major Campbell and Lieutenant McDougall, sent to treat with Pontiac, were seized, and Campbell later was tortured to death. A relief expedition from Niagara, led by Lieutenant Cuyler, and consisting of 96 men, convoying boats loaded with provisions and ammunition, was cut off near the mouth of the Detroit River by Wyandots. Only 2 boatloads of men, in one of which was the wounded Cuyler, escaped to carry news of the loss to Fort Niagara. The other soldiers were killed, except for 3 who by a bold dash reached Detroit. It was July before help finally arrived. 22 barges, carrying several cannon, ammunition, and supplies, and bearing 280 men, numbering among them the redoubtable Robert Rogers and 20 of his rangers. Commanding this expedition was Captain James Dalzell. A fog helped the convoy ascend the Detroit River, but presently it lifted, and the savages opened fire. In running the gauntlet, 15 men were killed or wounded, but the garrison was rejoiced at the arrival of these welcome reinforcements. Dalzell was hot to attack Pontiac's village, which the chief had coolly established only 3 miles north of the fort and on the same side of the river. At last he got Baldwin's reluctant permission. At 2 o'clock, the morning of July 31st, 1763, the rash captain set out with 250 men. Halfway to the Ottawa camp, the soldiers began to cross a bridge over Parent's Creek, since called Bloody Run. In the darkness rose the wild war-whoop, and a blast of gunfire knocked down half the advance guard of 25 men. Appalled, the survivors fell back. Dalzell rushed forward, sword in hand, and shouting encouragement to rally his troops. He led a charge across the bridge, but the Indians simply faded into the trees and bushes, from which their guns sent a continual hail of death. It was retreat or die. With Dalzell bravely bringing up the rear, the men began their return to the fort. Twice the captain was wounded, as guns blazed in the night on both sides of the road. At last, when trying to save a wounded sergeant, he was killed. Along the way, some Indians kept up a deadly fire from an empty house. Rogers and his rangers broke into it, drove out the savages, and from it covered the retreat with their rifles, being the last to follow into the fort after 6 hours of fighting. So ended Dalzell's scheme to catch Pontiac napping, with a loss of 59 men, including Dalzell himself. The Indians lost no more than 15 or 20, and still the siege continued, a siege without parallel in the history of American Indian warfare. For almost 5 months, from early May to late September, Pontiac besieged the place. No other Indian chief ever showed such grim perseverance and determination. Fort Pitt had during this time proved as hard a nut to crack as Detroit. No chief of Pontiac's stature was there to direct the assault, thirsty for blood and longing for scalps. The young warriors of the Delawares and Shawnees began a series of premature raids, killing at least 100 traders and many settlers in isolated cabins. Thus warned, the garrison destroyed all buildings about the fort to prevent their being used as cover by the enemy. Fort Pitt was well built. It was 5-sided, with walls partly of brick, and was armed with a number of cannon. Within it, the whites in the vicinity were gathered for safety. When the attack came on the night of July 26th, it was in the form of a continuous heavy fire of small arms. The Indians dug pits from which to shoot, and a few men fell on the ramparts. For 6 entire days and nights, the whizzing bullets sped against the walls, while fire arrows arced over the rampart and kept the garrison busy extinguishing blazes. Though the women and children were put in places of safety, the men were nearly exhausted by constant duty on the parapets. Then suddenly, as it began, the attack ceased. Relieved but fearful, the defenders wondered where the Indians had gone and why. There was a reason. Marching along the road, built by Forbes in 1758, was Colonel Bouquet, who had distinguished himself with Washington in the capture of Duquesne. He had with him only about 500 men, but they were battalions of 2 famous regiments, the Highland Black Watch and the Royal Americans. By August 5th, Bouquet reached Bushy Run, about 25 miles from Fort Pitt. It was an area of bloody history. A few miles away, Braddock's force had been destroyed, and still nearer, Grant had suffered his defeat. Bouquet knew Indians were in the vicinity, because scalping parties had skulked about his column for days. But early that afternoon, heavy firing and the usual wild yelling at the front heralded a major battle. The Indians who had been besieging Fort Pitt were attacking him. Like the howling of wild beasts in the forest, their war cries came from every quarter as they took advantage of their snake-like mobility to surround the army, pouring upon it a constant fire. Bouquet was no Braddock. He ordered his men to lie flat rather than stand and fire by volleys. Even so, the Highlanders and Royal Americans suffered severely. By nightfall, 60 men and several officers were dead or wounded. When the battle lulled at dark, Bouquet retreated to a little hill, placing his men by companies in a circle with a crude little enclosure of sacks of flour in the center to protect such of the wounded as had escaped the ruthless scalping knife. He supposed that night would be his last, as he said in a report he wrote to his superior, General Jeffrey Amherst. Yet he did not stop planning and thinking in those dark hours. His only hope of victory was to bring his will-o'-the-wisp enemies to a stand where his men could get at them. So that night he formed a daring plan. Next morning the Indians resumed their attack on his haggard band, and for 4 hours the firing continued, the red men growing increasingly bold. Watching this, at the right moment, Bouquet gave the word for a crafty move, in which he had schooled his soldiers during the night. All at once 2 companies of Highlanders fell back, as if retreating, and left a gap in the line. Exultantly, the Indians leaped forward in a yelling mass to cut the center out of the white army, and charged straight into the gap. But the Highlanders, far from retreating, merely hid in a ravine where they were not seen. Now, with yells as fierce as any of the Indians had given, they drew their claymores, basket-hilted swords, with which Highland rank and file were then armed, and sprang forward to kill. At the same time, the companies on either side of the gap charged in. Caught in the jaws of this amazing trap, the Indians simply melted. Many were cut down by the ferocious Highlanders. The others fled, leaving their dead behind. Bouquet's loss was 115 men and officers, killed or wounded, but he had crushed the Indians and saved Fort Pitt. The Battle of Bushy Run, one of the most brilliant and hard-fought of all the Indian wars, was the decisive blow in the Pontiac War. At the time, Pontiac learned that the French, on whom he had counted, would not help him. His dream of expelling the white men was shattered. Broken-hearted, he offered peace, and his tribes buried the hatchet. As for the great Pontiac himself, he was murdered by a tomahawk in the hands of a Kaskaskia Indian in April 1769. The killer had been bribed with a barrel of liquor by an English trader named Williamson to do the foul deed. Chapter 7. Tories and Iroquois. Even before the Pontiac War, American frontiersmen were pressing far into the Indian country, so long disputed. D. Boone sealed a bar on the tree in year 1760. That inscription found carved on an aged beech tree would indicate that Daniel Boone, greatest of the pioneers, was in Kentucky as early as 1760. This has been disputed, yet it is very possible, for in that year he was 25 or 26 years old, a veteran long hunter. The presence of such men and their families created endless trouble with the Indians, and the record of ambushes, raids, and fights in the forest can never be completed, for simple lack of a record of their numberless events. The frontier developed men of every type. Boone ranks as a true forest nobleman. The opposite end of the scale was the notorious Simon Girty, son of a drunken Irish trader, adopted by the Senecas, a provincial soldier for a time, then a deserter who went back to the savages, and became more savage than they in bloody exploits and inhuman tortures of prisoners. It was during the American Revolution, however, that the Indians again became a real menace. The Iroquois in 1775 had been reduced by their wars so that even with adopted prisoners in their ranks, they numbered fewer than 1,500 warriors. Sir William Johnson, commissioner to the Iroquois and married to a Mohawk girl, had kept all of them except the Senecas from the warpath during the Pontiac uprising. But as it became apparent that the colonies would rebel against King George III, he was so torn between his loyalty to his king and his friendship toward the colonist that, knowing the Iroquois would go either way at his word, he secluded himself and died suddenly in 1774 by his own hand, it is believed. His son, Sir John Johnson, and his neighbors, Guy Johnson, Colonel John Butler, and the latter's son, Captain Walter Butler, were thorough Tories who had no scruples about using Indians against their neighbors on the frontier. This was easy, since the Mohawks resented the settlers, chiefly German Americans, who were pushing up the Mohawk Valley with their farms. Besides, Molly Brant, the Mohawk woman who was Sir William's widow, had a brother educated as a member of the family by her late husband, who was an influential chief of the Iroquois, Joseph Brant. Brant's Indian name was Thayendanegea. He was 33 years old, had been to London, could read, write, and speak English well, and had fought for the British since he was only 13 years old. A tall, dignified man, polite in manner, he was quite handsome, especially in his keen eyes and bold chin and nose. These 5 men, 4 English-American Tories, and a Mohawk chief, succeeded in winning to the English cause most of the Iroquois. Only the Onondagas and part of the Tuscaroras refused to join them. At first, there were a few minor raids in northern New York, but in the spring of 1777, handsome Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Leger of the British Army, a veteran of the French and Indian War, appeared at Oswego. There he began forming an army of Tories and Indians. His orders were to march with this force up the Oswego River and down the Mohawk. Near Albany, he was expected to join General John Burgoyne, who with the main British army was then beginning his campaign to cut the colonies in two. With that, murderous action began. St. Leger started his march with 1,200 men. Tories under the Johnsons and Butlers and Iroquois under Brant. The Indians burned houses, ran off livestock, and killed and scalped as they advanced, until they encountered a stubborn Dutchman, Colonel Peter Gonsvoort, with 550 men at Fort Stanwix, where Rome, New York now stands. Stanwix was almost a ruin, yet it was defended with such courage that St. Leger was brought to a halt while he besieged the place for 3 weeks. To the rescue marched old General Nicholas Herkimer, also a veteran of the French and Indian War, but an American leader now with almost 800 Tryon County militia. He had at one time tried to get Brant to join the Patriot side, but had failed. Now, as he neared Stanwix, he managed to get a messenger through to Gonsvoort with a plan to attack St. Leger from both sides at the same time, the signal to be that 3 cannon shots from the fort. On the night of August 5th, Herkimer halted 8 miles from Stanwix to await the signal. His officers thought him too cautious. After a heated argument, in which the general was accused of everything from cowardice to outright treason, he at length, against his better judgment, ordered an advance the morning of August 6th. It was exactly what the enemy wanted, about 2 miles west of Oriskany Creek, in a marshy ravine choked with timber. The Americans were suddenly beset on all sides by Iroquois and Tories. A battle ensued, so bloody and bitter as rarely to have been equaled. Early, a bullet killed Herkimer's horse and shattered the old general's leg. Ordering his saddle placed under a tree, he sat on it, calmly lit his pipe, and directed the defense. Again and again the Indians charged, but his men, raw though they were, fought like veterans under the eye of their leader, seeing that often, when one of his soldiers fired, a savage would rush forward and tomahawk him before he could reload. Herkimer put 2 men behind each tree, one to shoot, while the other reserved his fire, with a ball ready to stop such tactics. It seemed that human courage and endurance could hardly withstand any longer the constantly growing losses and the ferocious pressure of the overwhelming enemy force. Then, as if to make still more terrible the already deadly conflict with the piercing yells, its roar of gunfire, and its cries of the wounded, a thunderstorm burst over the scene. This came with such violence of lightning, rain, and wind that it awed both sides into suspending the battle temporarily. Actually, it saved Herkimer's men. When the wild storm passed and fighting began again, the men from Fort Stanwix arrived, and the Tories and Iroquois retreated from the field. Brave old Herkimer died from loss of blood. Of his men, 200 were dead, and twice as many wounded or taken prisoner. But Oriskany has been called the turning point of the Revolution. It was the first setback of the Burgoyne campaign, in which that general eventually surrendered his army in the decisive siege of Saratoga. At the appearance of a force under Benedict Arnold, not yet a traitor, St. Leger was driven out of the campaign, all the way back to Oswego. His losses had been greater than Herkimer's. Smarting from their defeat, the Iroquois in their retreat tortured many of their prisoners to death. They craved revenge, and Black Snake, Little Beard, and Corn Planter left red trails of slaughter across the Undilla Hills in months following. Most terrible of the Iroquois massacres were those in the Vale of Wyoming, near Kingston, Pennsylvania, June 3rd to 6th, 1778, and in Cherry Valley, Otsego County, New York, November 11th, 1778. The Wyoming massacre has been called the surpassing horror of the Revolution. When John Butler, with 900 Indians and 200 Tories, stole down on the valley, June 3rd, most of the able-bodied men were away with Washington's army. Colonel Zebulon Butler, a patriot cousin of the Tory leader, happened to be home on furlough when word was brought of the oncoming horde. Hurriedly gathering the families at Forty Fort, north of Kingston, with about 300 old men and boys, he tried to form some sort of a fighting force. Untrained as they were, and armed with ancient fowling pieces and flintlocks, they were full of fight. When reports of Indian atrocities began coming in, they demanded to be led against the enemy. Colonel Butler doubtfully consented, and disaster was the result. Though outnumbered nearly 4-1, the thin American line held until the Iroquois slipped around the flank and attacked it from the rear. What followed might have been expected: a rout. Mohawks, Senecas, and Cayugas, dropping their guns, bounded in pursuit, with only their tomahawks to deal death. Of the Americans, 240 were slain. In the next 3 terrible days, every house in the valley was burned, sometimes, it is said, with the occupants who locked themselves within. Queen Esther's Rock is pointed out as the place where the fiend of Wyoming, a mixed-blood Indian squaw named Esther Montour, granddaughter of a French nobleman, in sheer bloodlust, killed 16 helpless prisoners who were held by brawny warriors for her murdering tomahawk. Brent was not present at Wyoming, but he was at the Cherry Valley slaughter, an equally brutal scene. Not a man's life was spared there, and every house was burned but one, which was used to hold the women and children, later taken away as captives. Dreadful as they were, Wyoming and Cherry Valley had a decisive result. Justly furious, General Washington determined to punish the Iroquois so that they could never recover. The next summer, 1779, he sent General John Sullivan with 2,500 men and General James Clinton with 1,500 more to scourge the enemy's country. Brant tried to draw aside this invasion by raiding Minisink, Orange County, New York, and defeated a small American force there on June 20th, but he lost so heavily that he had to retreat. During this time, the American generals, refusing to be drawn aside, had marched up the Mohawk Valley. Brant hastened back, but he could muster no more than 600 warriors against 4,000 men. At Chemung and Newton Creeks, near present Elmira, New York, his Indians and Tories were brushed aside in brief battles. For the first time in all history, the Iroquois were swept from their own country. Thereafter Sullivan and Clinton ravaged the entire Indian area. Few Iroquois were killed, and the few taken prisoner were well treated, but 40 Indian villages were burned, 160,000 bushels of corn and beans destroyed, countless fruit orchards cut down, and all livestock driven away. The Iroquois were left destitute, their power forever broken. Most of them went over into Canada, where their descendants still live. Thus did the once terrible Iroquois make their exit from history, with the wailing of their women the only requiem for the departed glories of the great Confederation that once held half of Eastern America in dread of its slightest frown. Never again would Indian war disfigure New York and New England. But west of the Allegheny Mountains, an ominous new cloud was gathering, which would break soon in a bloody storm. Chapter 8. The Greatest Indian Victory. After the Revolution, in spite of the peace treaty, the British kept their garrisons in the border forts, such as Detroit, Oswego, Niagara, Michilimackinac, and Miami, the latter an invasion of nearly 40 miles into the United States territory. Those forts controlled the fur trade of the Great Lakes. British interest, combined with hatred of the new American nation, caused them to supply Indians with weapons, supplies, and other gifts, and keep them stirred up in constant raids against the frontier. In the South, General John Sevier taught a bloody lesson to the Cherokees, which they never forgot. In that war, a young red-headed lieutenant led some brilliant expeditions against the Indians. His name was Andrew Jackson, and he went on to become one of the mighty figures of our history, the greatest military hero of his day in America, and president of the nation. Yet in spite of such efforts, on the frontier between 1783 and 1790, more than 1,500 men, women, and children were killed, wounded, or carried off by Indians, and much property looted or destroyed. When George Washington took oath as the first president, April 30th, 1789, one of the countless problems confronting him was the question of the Indians, complicated by the attitude of Britain and the fear that if the tribes were attacked, it might bring on another war with that nation. But Washington refused to let the people of the frontiers continue to suffer. On September 30th, 1790, he took a calculated risk in sending General Josiah Harmer to defeat the Indian Confederacy that had grown up north of the Ohio. The choice of commander was unfortunate. Harmer had served bravely enough in the Revolution as a subordinate under the very capable General Nathanael Greene. Given a command of his own, however, he proved to be unimaginative, slow-thinking, and easily fooled by his enemy. A new Indian military genius had arisen. He was a Miami chief named Little Turtle, 38 years old in 1790. His face was that of a leader, with its large, dark, intensely searching eyes, very high forehead, hooked nose, and wide, grim mouth. It was said of him his manner was so reserved that none of the other chiefs liked him. Nevertheless, his word was never broken, and his knowledge of war was so great that the Indians all obeyed him. One of his under-chiefs was Tecumseh, a young Shawnee who, though only 22 years old, already was notable among his people. A second was Red Jacket, a famous Seneca orator. A third was Simon Girty, the cruel white renegade. With a force of Miamis, Shawnees, Delawares, Wyandots, and a few Iroquois, Little Turtle set out to face Harmer when the latter, with 1,435 officers and men, marched from Fort Washington, Cincinnati, Ohio, in October. He found the task to his liking, for Harmer was so much his inferior in strategy that the Miami chief played with him as a child would play with a toy. First, he sent a swift-moving band of warriors to act as a decoy. Harmer swallowed the bait and detached a flying column of 800 militia under Colonel John Hardin to catch those rash Indians. As soon as this column was sufficiently separated from Harmer, it was in trouble. Along his line of march, Hardin found Indian villages burned and deserted. Fearing he would lose his prey, he rushed forward with such haste that he blundered into a clever trap set by Little Turtle, who at the place had fewer warriors than were in Hardin's command. In the ambush, Hardin lost 23 killed, while inflicting hardly a casualty on the Indians. The militia fled, and Little Turtle had his first victory. Not daunted, Harmer received the flying soldiers, calmed them, and marched on. When he reached the Miami River, Little Turtle's warriors were all about him. One night, the Indians ran off most of the cavalry horses. So furious was Harmer that he again sent off 500 men under Hardin on a wild goose chase his adversary had marked out for him. Little Turtle must have smiled, having for the second time caused his enemy to divide his forces. He this time turned on the bewildered Harmer himself on October 22nd. In the fight that followed, the small army was punished severely with the loss of 150 men, among whom were 3 majors. Harmer had had quite enough of Little Turtle. When Hardin rejoined him, he retreated hastily to Fort Washington. The defeat was a heavy blow to American prestige, and Washington knew it must be retrieved. He called General Arthur St. Clair, governor of the Northwest Territory, to Philadelphia. St. Clair was a brave but aging officer with white hair who was in ill health. He had served well under Washington at the battles of Trenton, Princeton, and elsewhere, and the president trusted him. Washington knew Indian fighting. He had cut his military eye-teeth on it. As he gave St. Clair command of a new army to invade the Indian country, his final warning was very earnest. Beware of a surprise. You know how the Indians fight, and I repeat, beware of a surprise. It was October 3rd, 1791, when St. Clair, with 2,000 men, including 2 regiments of infantry, with artillery and cavalry, set out from Fort Washington. Very slowly he advanced, building and garrisoning forts on the way, until when he reached the Wabash River, he had only about 1,400 men with him. There, on the evening of November 3rd, his army went into camp. St. Clair was sick and confined to his tent. The night passed without event. In the morning, the drums beat reveille as usual. The troops held roll call formation, then were dismissed for breakfast. At this moment, Little Turtle struck with the sudden deadliness of a rattlesnake. Without warning, from the woods where they had been concealed all night, bounded a wave of ferocious, painted, whooping savages. Little Turtle knew just where to hurl his charge. Full on a regiment of militia, ill-trained and ill-officered, the shock fell. Tomahawked and shot down by the terrifying savage horde, the militia broke and ran, throwing into confusion even the regulars, who were forming as fast as they could seize their weapons. St. Clair was almost captured in his tent by that first screaming Indian rush. A charge by the regulars saved him. Half-dressed, his white locks streaming in the air, he took command with the greatest personal bravery. With the bayonet, the regulars pursued the Indians into the forest. This also was a part of Little Turtle's plan. He had warriors planted in places of concealment, from which they blasted the troops, as Braddock had been blasting long before. As the soldiers stumbled out of the ambush, a second thunderbolt charge by Little Turtle drove in the American left flank. There the artillery was parked. In a few bloody moments, almost every artilleryman was killed, and all the cannon put out of commission. Their flank turned, the death yell in their ears, and the painted foe swarming about them. The bewildered soldiers were pushed into a huddled mass, in which at almost every moment gaps were cut by the sleet of lead from the surrounding trees and underbrush. Despairing and knowing all was lost, St. Clair after 2 hours gave the order to retreat. Utterly demoralized, his troops threw down guns, knapsacks, everything in a disgraceful, panic-stricken rout. Behind them raged the Indians, slaying. They might have killed every one of the white soldiers, had they not stopped to loot the camp. As it was, more than 900 men lay dead on that stricken field. St. Clair escaped on an old baggage mule. It was the greatest military disaster ever suffered by American arms against Indians. It is the solitary American battle which has no name. St. Clair's defeat is the only title by which it is known. When the news of it reached Washington, he cried in passion, "It's all over. St. Clair is defeated, routed. The officers nearly all killed, the men by the wholesale, the rout complete." Too shocking to think of, and a surprise in the bargain. Yet he gave St. Clair a fair hearing. The general was exonerated of negligence and lack of courage, but resigned his commission and office. Putting down the Indian menace had now become a grim necessity. In the crisis, Washington turned to General Anthony Wayne, a hero of the Revolution, called Mad Anthony, because of his fearlessness in battle. Wayne, a tough fighter, 46 years old in 1791, was so devoted to Washington that he was once quoted as saying, "I would charge into hell if General Washington gave the command." He had been brilliant during the Revolution, particularly in his capture of Stony Point, a British stronghold, by night, and his daring exploits were a legend in the army. He was shrewd as well as tempestuous. When he received his orders from his chief, he began by enlisting 1,000 men, chiefly from the frontiers. Then he drilled them. He was a superb drill master, and before he was through with those frontier hunters, they were soldiers, a disciplined, hard-fighting unit, proud of the name he gave them, the Legion of the United States. For uniforms, they wore bearskin caps, fringed hunting shirts, and Indian moccasins. They knew how to load their rifles on the run, and were trained to such a fine pitch that even against an imaginary enemy they would leap into icy water in a bayonet charge. With the Legion and militia and cavalry raising his force to 3,000 men, Wayne marched north in the spring of 1793, along the trail of his predecessors, Harmer and St. Clair. He built Fort Recovery at the site of St. Clair's defeat, and buried the bones of hundreds of men found there. Little Turtle, that savage tactician, had been trying every ruse and trick he knew. He sought to cut off detachments, but Wayne was too alert. He attacked Fort Recovery and was heavily repulsed. His warriors stalked the sentry lines, hoping to find a man asleep, but in vain. His efforts to stampede the troop horses failed. So impressed was the great Miami that he urged his people to make peace with the chief that never sleeps. The tribes refused, so Little Turtle prepared to fight. He chose a battlefield ideally suited to his method of fighting. A few miles from the British-held Fort Miami, Maumee, Ohio, a tornado had at one time swept through the forest, leaving a tangled swath of prostrate trees, over which it seemed impossible for an army to pass. There Little Turtle posted his warriors, and there, August 20th, 1794, the Battle of Fallen Timbers was fought. The Indian leader, to oppose Wayne's 3,000 men, had only about 1,300 warriors and some 70 Canadian and English Rangers. And of these, only about 800 actually took part in the fight. Wayne formed his troops in a double line. The first line, composed of the Legion, was to charge, the second line was to support it, and the mounted volunteers were to sweep around and fall on the Indian rear. But the fury of the first wave of assault carried all before it. Tecumseh, one of whose brothers was killed at his side, did his utmost to keep his Shawnee in line, and Turkey Track, an Ottawa chief, was killed rallying his braves. The Indians could not stand against the Legion's bayonets. Over the tangled mass of fallen timbers, the soldiers clambered and leaped, yelling like the Indians themselves. In a few moments, Little Turtle's warriors were in retreat. Driven from their defenses, they fled, pursued by the cavalry 7 miles to the very walls of Fort Miami. There they expected shelter by the British, but the gates were not opened, and Wayne's horsemen mercilessly cut down all who could not escape. Fallen Timbers ended a generation of Indian wars. Wayne lost 44 killed and 89 wounded. Little Turtle's loss was 3 times as great. The following year, on August 3, 1795, the chiefs signed a treaty of peace at Greenville, Ohio. As he made his mark, Little Turtle said, "I am the last to sign it, and I will be the last to break it." He was true to his word. Later he visited President Washington at Philadelphia. He died peacefully at Fort Wayne, Indiana, July 14, 1812. Though the Battle of Fallen Timbers ended the war trail for Little Turtle, it may be said to have been the start of the career of another great Indian, and of his labors which made his name more famous in his time than that of any other member of his race.